Lina. Thank you, Lina. My name is Colleen Gordon. I am the co-chair of the OREF Forms Committee for 2022, and I am excited to bring you the revisions that will be rolling out to your OREF library in the next few days, actually coming out very quickly. The updates have all been submitted to our platform providers, our platform provider partners, and they should be available and live in your accounts on January 3rd. So we're just a few days away from them launching. They should automatically convert from the 2022 versions to the 2023 versions. Today's class is a webinar format. And so everybody's cameras and microphones are turned off, with the exception of mine. And I also with me have Lina from OREF and Melissa, the executive officer from OREF, joining today. They are going to help with fielding questions. We will be using the Q&A section on your Zoom navigation bar. So if you look at where your navigation bar is, you'll see a Q&A section. If you want to type in your questions as we go through the material, Lina is going to be watching those questions as they come through. I love to field questions as we're talking about a particular form, but also know that there will be time at the end of the class for any additional questions regarding the form changes that we're covering today. And while this class is scheduled for an hour and a half, if questions exceed that time frame, just know that I'm more than willing to stay on this meeting as long as it takes to answer the questions that you have regarding the 2023 form revisions. It's important to note that there are no statutory changes to the forms library this year. All of the updates that we're going to be covering are a direct result of subscriber feedback and requests. The OREF Forms Committee is a group of volunteer brokers from across Oregon who work in partnership with legal and industry professionals to prepare transaction and advisory forms. So let's go over a quick overview of some of the changes that you may have already seen in your forms library. Some updates that OREF launched in 2022 include a relaunch of our Spanish translation library. So if you missed the announcement earlier this year, OREF forms are now available in both Spanish and English. The Spanish translation forms provide a valuable resource when working with Spanish-speaking clients. And then just last month, we launched a commercial library. So OREF has two separate form committees now, one for residential and one for commercial, and two separate libraries that you've probably already noticed in your form provider platforms. So the OREF commercial library launched, offering a wide variety of standardized forms for commercial subscribers. Now, it's important to note that the commercial sale agreement that existed previously in your OREF library has been moved from the residential library and is now housed only in the commercial library. So if you are looking for that commercial sale agreement and having trouble finding it, just know that you may need to switch from the residential to the commercial library in order to access that document, but it is definitely still there for you. If you'd like to learn more about the commercial library, you can go to our website, orefonline.com, go to resources and form updates. In addition, there is the entire slide deck for this presentation today. So as we go through the material, if you want to have a copy of the slide deck, including all of my my facilitator notes, those are all also available on orefonline.com. And a recording of this class is also being submitted to Online Ed, which you'll have an opportunity to access that. Melissa, I'm not sure if you're on, is that available yet or coming soon?
It should be available either today or tomorrow. They're finalizing it now.
Awesome. All right. So if you can't get enough about talking about OREF forms, or you love to listen to me teach classes, just know that that opportunity is going to be available through online ed as well. All right, other releases that we've seen, we're going to cover 6 new forms, 4 of which are already active in your library. 2 will be active in your library starting next week. So already released, we have Form 000A, Things to Know Before You Sign. Form 104, Advisory to Buyers and Sellers Regarding Fair Housing. Form 105, Solar Panel System Advisory and Addendum. And 106, Advisory Regarding Tenant Occupied Properties. And then next week, you'll see Form 000, Realtor Guide, and Form 107, which is a referral fee agreement. So we're going to take some time now to go through those new forms. The ones that are already live in your library, you won't see on the screen any large print of the form. Just know that they are available in Zip Forms, DocuSign, SkySlope, whichever platform you use. Those first 4 forms are already live and available for use. So the first form we have is Form 000A, Things to Know Before You Sign. This form was previously known as What Buyers and Sellers Need to Know, or what I used to refer to as the Sale Agreement Cliff Notes. This is a tool designed to assist you in educating your clients about the critical considerations that go into a real estate sale agreement. The summary outlines consumers' rights and obligations when agreeing to the legally binding contract that governs the property sale. Definitions and explanations are provided so that your client can be best equipped to move forward with the transaction. Improved wording and formatting makes it easier for buyers and sellers to read, and it now covers more sections of the sale agreement. This form is also available in our Spanish translation library as well. So you can provide this as a supplement to the residential sale agreement in both English and Spanish. The next form we have, Form 104, Advisory to Buyers and Sellers Regarding Fair Housing. This risk reduction tool explains to clients that it is illegal to discriminate against any person because of a protected class. Federal and state protected classes include race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, familial status, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, legal source of income, and victims or survivors of domestic violence. Local jurisdictions may add additional protected classes. This advisory can be used if you are representing either a buyer or a seller to advise them of the fair housing requirements that exist in the sale and leasing of real estate. Form 105, another new form added to your library, Solar Panel System Advisory and Addendum. Because so many solar panel systems are subject to an agreement with a third party, this form should be initiated by a seller to advise the buyer of these scenarios and define a timeline for the buyer to review documentation pertaining to the system and the third party agreement. The seller is responsible for providing all of the documentation regarding the solar panel system, and buyers should promptly review the documentation and perform their due diligence regarding any financing arrangements to avoid delays in closing. The idea with this form is to engage in discussion regarding the solar panel system at the beginning of a transaction. We receive feedback from subscribers with experiences where a buyer didn't realize that they needed to assume the lease until just before closing. So this gives the seller the opportunity to disclose the information regarding the solar panel system and encourages the buyer to do their due diligence right up front so that there are no delays with closing. The next form we have is Form 106, Advisory Regarding Tenant Occupied Properties. In response to subscriber requests, the committee created this form to remind buyers of the various issues that arise when buying a property that is or may become occupied by tenants. The form points out that laws and CC&Rs may impose restrictions on the use of property and an owner's ability to terminate a lease, that there are important considerations for financing and insuring a rental property, that discrimination must be avoided, and that special contingencies may be needed in the sale agreement. Now, this advisory can be used with both buyers and sellers. It's highly recommended when representing a seller who has a tenant in the property that this form is provided to the seller so that you as the listing broker can discuss the logistics of the potential removal of the tenant and the possible need for a contingency. The sale agreement itself does not have a contingency that makes the sale subject to the seller successfully removing the tenant, but it does have a provision where the buyer can request that the seller become responsible for removal of the tenant. If the tenant doesn't voluntarily follow through with vacating the property as prescribed by law and through the notices delivered by the seller, the contractual obligation to the buyer could be impacted if the seller can't meet the close date and deliver possession on time. So it may be necessary for the seller to have a contingency to protect them in the event that they have to leverage the eviction process in order to remove a tenant to satisfy the contractual terms that they've entered into with a buyer to purchase the property. And the next form we have, not yet live in your forms library, but will be next week, Form 000 Realtor Guide. The committee updated the guide to using OREF forms. This was formerly called the matrix in your forms library. It more precisely describes each document in your forms library. It provides helpful tips for users. It includes all the new forms that we're covering, and it's color coded with form types to help refine your search so that you can find the forms you're looking for more quickly and what the proper usage for those forms are. Now, this guide should not be relied on in lieu of legal advice. If a client needs further advice regarding the legal effect of a specific form, they should seek legal counsel. And the next form that will hit your library next week is Form 107, the referral fee agreements. This form has been added as an optional resource for securing a written agreement with another broker for the referral of a prospective client. We received a request to add this form to the library, as not all brokerages have their own referral form in their forms library. So we've added this as an addition to your OREF library. It's not intended to replace anything your firm may already have in place. Please check with your managing principal broker regarding how to properly execute referral agreements for your company. The form can be used if you are referring a buyer or a seller, and it can be used if the same client is both going to sell a property and then purchase a property through the referral. Now, it's important to note that if the client that's being referred is both a sale and a purchase client, you need to complete both sections on the middle of the form. Lines 12 through 26 are where we address the client type that is being referred. If you check both boxes for buyer and seller, you need to make sure you complete all of the information in each of those sections. Each section defines the compensation to the referring broker for that particular part of the transaction. All right, any questions so far on the new forms that have been added to the library?
No questions just yet.
All right. We will keep watching for those questions. Again, feel free to type those questions into the Q&A section, and Awesome Lina is going to monitor those questions for me so that we can get them answered while we're on the form that's being discussed. All right, now let's get into the changes that you're going to see in the 2023 versions of the forms. You'll see we've got a nice long list of forms that are getting updates or revisions, starting with the residential sale agreement, farms and ranch, new construction, vacant land, condominium, and manufactured home sale agreements. We have changes to our addenda. The backup addendum has had some significant changes that we'll go through. Notice of completion of repairs, the advisory to buyers regarding condominiums and townhomes, the agreement to occupy before closing, and the agreement to occupy after closing, the termination agreement, professional inspection addendum, extraordinary event addendum, which was previously your COVID-19 addendum, and then the VA FHA amendatory clause. Now, as we go through these changes, we're only going to cover the changes in the residential sale agreement. If those changes translate into the other forms, note that those forms will be updated. So for example, as we go through section 9 of the residential sale agreement, those changes will apply to all other versions of the sale agreement. But in the interest of time, we're not going to cover those changes in each individual sale agreement. Now, there are 2 sale agreements in addition to the residential that do have some very specific changes, which we will cover. Those include the new construction sale agreement and the manufactured home sale agreement. Find any questions I can tackle?
Yes. So the first question is, do you know if the commercial sale agreement will be available in zip forms, or is that another fee?
The Zip Forms is one of our platform providers. I was just in my Zip Forms account yesterday and saw clearly the residential library and the commercial library both there. So just make sure that you select on the drop down in Zip Forms the commercial library in order to access that.
I'll just chime in really quick too, Colleen.
Yeah.
So depending on if you have a Zip Forms individual account or a Zip Forms brokerage account, there might be different ways for you to get that library into your account. If you go to our website to resources, we have instructions on how to do it. You can always reach out to customer service if you're having an issue with it, but there is not an additional fee for the commercial library that's included in the standard subscription.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. Great info.
And then the next question is, are the current forms required in a transaction 104, 106, 105?
So that's going to be a question to discuss with your managing principal broker. OREF does not define whether or not a form is required. That is a brokerage specific question.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the residential sale agreement changes. The first change we're going to see is in section 4, which begins with the buyer representing that the buyer has liquid and available funds for the deposit and down payment or full purchase price if it's a cash transaction. So nothing has changed in this section as the buyer is making their representations regarding financing. The buyer is representing they have liquid and available funds for the deposit and the down payment. We have the line to include any contingent source of funds that needs to be disclosed to the seller. So if the buyer's getting gift funds from grandma or getting the down payments from the proceeds of the sale of their existing home, those lines still exist to write those in as exceptions. What we've added is a line right after that to clarify if this transaction is contingent upon the buyer obtaining the above mentioned funds, buyer will add an express contingency in section 8 of this agreement. Now, section 8 is additional provisions regarding financing. So if the buyer wants the benefit of protecting their earnest money, if they don't get that contingent source of funds, maybe grandma doesn't come through with the gift funds at the last minute. In order for the buyer to have that as a contingency, it would need to be expressly written into section 8. Disclosing a contingent source of funds and actually creating a contingency would be two separate things. So we just wanted to clarify that disclosing the contingent source of funds doesn't automatically make the sale contingent upon the buyer receiving those funds. The next change we have is in section 9. So section 9 is our title insurance section. It's had several updates throughout the form, starting with the term at seller sole expense. Previously, that was in the opening statement. It's now been relocated. It still exists in section 9, but it's clarifying that at seller sole expense is based on the owner's standard form policy of title insurance that the seller is responsible for paying for. Now, because escrow acts upon written instruction by both buyer and seller, the language was updated to reflect that the parties instruct escrow to furnish the reports and documents to buyer as soon as the reports and documents are available. Then we've added some additional language to clarify what happens if a supplemental preliminary title report is issued after the initial title report has been delivered to the buyer. So as you can see here, we've added that statement upon receipt of the report and documents and upon receipt of each supplement to the reports and documents that contains material information previously unknown to the buyer. Buyer will have a default of 5 business days within which to notify the seller in writing of any objections. So we've clarified that if a supplemental report is issued by title and there is material information that was not in the previous reports that could impact a buyer's decision to purchase the property, the buyer does get the 5 business day timeline to start back over to provide the seller with any written objections. Now, if that supplemental report doesn't include any material information that wasn't on the previous report, the 5-day right to object does not restart. But just adding that clarification that the buyer does get that opportunity to object if new information is delivered through the preliminary title report and supporting documents. And then the last change to section 9 that we have is the removal of the reference regarding TRID language. So as stated by NAR, the TRID or TIL RESPA integrated disclosure rule took effect in 2015 for the purpose of harmonizing the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, RESPA, and the Truth in Lending Act, TILA. Disclosures and regulations. Now that the industry has had 7 years to become accustomed to using the rule, there is no longer any need for the sale agreement to point out that states differ as to which party customarily pays for title insurance. So the note addressing this subject has been deleted from the title insurance section of the sale agreement, and the definition of TRID has been moved to the closing disclosure where TRID is relevant. So we've simply removed the statement that the seller is responsible for paying for the title insurance policy under TRID requirements. We've removed that from section 9, and the only reference now to TRID appears in section 29.9. Any questions so far, Lina?
No new questions.
Section 10 is our inspection contingency. In general, there have been no changes to the inspection contingency. However, one of the options a buyer has in regards to the creation of an inspection contingency has had a change. That option was added last year to the sale agreement, and it gave the buyer the opportunity to have informational only inspections. So the buyer was not electing to have an inspection contingency, but they wanted to retain the right to have professional inspections just to know what they were buying. Feedback from subscribers was that if this is going to be an option for buyers, it should probably include a time limit for when the buyer needs to do those informational inspections and clarification around, sorry, the word just went right out of my head. Invasive inspections. So if there's going to be any invasive inspections or testing or removal of any portion of the property, the buyer should have to disclose that. These were great suggestions. So we've gone ahead and modified this option. So again, this is the option. Buyer does not want an inspection contingency. They're waiving their right. However, they want to have informational inspections. So we've added, at buyer's expense, buyer may have the property inspected by one or more licensed professionals of buyer's choice for informational purposes only. Buyer must specifically identify in this agreement any desired invasive inspections that may include testing or removal of any portion of the property, for example, radon and mold. And we've added the line for the buyer to identify those invasive inspections. It goes on to say buyer will restore the property following any inspections or tests performed by buyer or on buyer's behalf. Buyer will have a default of 10 business days after the effective date in which to complete all inspections. So certainly that timeline can be negotiable, but now there is no concern for a seller that the buyer may be coming in and out of the property doing these informational inspections all the way up until closing. Next change we have is in section 21. This is our wood stove, wood burning fireplace insert section of the sale agreement. Feedback from subscribers was that buyers rarely have knowledge regarding whether or not a wood stove or wood burning insert is certified. So that question has actually been removed from the section. The section still has the first question: does the property contain a wood stove or wood burning fireplace insert, with the yes or no option. If the buyer marks yes, then the form goes on to say that the seller will promptly provide buyer with form 046 wood stove, wood burning fireplace insert addendum. So on that form, the very first section, the seller is representing to the buyer whether or not the wood stove or wood burning insert is certified. So rather than a buyer having to guess or mark unknown, we put the default automatically that if there is a wood stove or wood burning fireplace insert, the seller will provide that form, letting the buyer know whether or not it is certified. And we have questions?
Yes, so regarding invasive inspections, can we write any the buyer wants or needs?
Absolutely. So yes, if you run out of space on the line, just I would recommend using additional provisions or attaching an addendum to specify the additional invasive inspections the buyer may want to perform.
And then the next question is, if material damage is found, the only recourse of the buyer is to suck it up or walk from their EM, correct?
Correct. If the buyer did not create a contingency, they've waived the right to unconditionally disapprove and terminate with a refund of their earnest money. So if that option was selected, the waiver of inspection contingency, and the buyer decides based on those inspections they don't want to proceed, unless there's another contingency in the contract they're leveraging, their earnest money is likely at risk.
The next question is the informational inspection still a contingency where the buyer could decide not to buy the property?
No, there is no right for the buyer to unconditionally disapprove and terminate the transaction. This is simply allowing the buyer the in and out opportunity for a period of time to investigate what they're purchasing. So they might want to have contractors come in, they might have an inspection and they say, we're going to buy it regardless, but we want to know what it is we're inheriting before we close.
And then the next question is, can you define promptly?
I cannot. Our legal counsel probably could. It is a commonly used legal term. You can't intentionally delay. As with all provisions in our sale agreement, time is of the essence. So the best I can say is promptly needs to be as soon as physically possible.
And then seller chooses to provide info on certification, but does not want to sign another form, question mark.
The sale agreement has always had verbiage in it that the seller will provide that form. What I do when I'm training agents in my office is when you're a listing agent taking a listing with a wood stove or wood burning insert, as part of your listing process, have the seller complete that form. You can then either add it to the MLS and have it available for buyer's agents to incorporate in with the offer, or you have it ready to deliver as soon as the parties have reached mutual agreement on the sale agreement.
That's all. Thank you. Oh, actually, there's one more. Is a wood burning insert different from a fireplace?
Yes. So an insert is a mechanism that goes inside of a fireplace. A brick and mortar fireplace doesn't meet the heat smart criteria that requires the removal and destruction of an uncertified wood stove. And for more information, in previous classes, there've been a lot of questions regarding the wood stove requirements. I would just encourage you, if you haven't looked at it, go to the DEQ website, specifically to the Heat Smart program, where you can get a lot more information regarding their requirements for removal and destruction. It addresses pellet stoves, antiques, and all of that stuff.
This question is regarding the addendum, the wood stove addendum. Remove the checkbox for seller to claim unknown if certified. What should seller do if they really don't know whether it's certified?
I don't know that the seller has anything they can do other than put the buyer on notice that they're not sure, which would then encourage the buyer through their home inspector or through the EPA website to verify whether or not it is certified.
And that's all. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right, the next change we have is section 29.3. We have removed this section completely. This was another TRID reference having to do with the payment of title costs, and we've moved all reference to TRID to section 29.9. The last change you're going to see in the residential sale agreement occurs in two places, both sections 41 and 42. We've added a clarifying line in both sections where the buyer and the seller are signing the sale agreement. So once the buyer is ready to sign their offer, this sentence has been added to address the fact that there will be two form providers in our marketplace. Starting in, I believe, February is when OR is launching their forms library. So we've added in section 41, because of the importance of consistent terminology and compatible documents, buyer has chosen to use this agreement and the other forms provided by Oregon Real Estate Forms LLC for this transaction. The buyer then submits the offer to the seller. If the seller accepts the offer as written in section 42, they sign accepting the offer. We've added that same sentence. However, it's the seller has chosen to use this agreement and the other forms provided by Oregon Real Estate Forms LLC for this transaction. So it's important to note that the two different libraries are not interchangeable. You can't start a sale on one form library and incorporate forms from a different form library. The terminology, the terms and conditions within each of the sale agreements is going to be significantly different. And so it's important that the parties mutually agree to stick with one form library through the duration of the transaction. So for clarity, once we reach mutual acceptance in both sections 41 and 42, the parties, if they're signing this agreement, are agreeing that OREF forms will be used for the duration of the transaction. The next change that we have is in the new residential construction real estate sale agreement. A subscriber informed the forms committee that section 27 of the new construction sale agreement could be confusing to buyers. Committee research revealed that when a CCB complaint is filed, it is not like an arbitration or a lawsuit. It is only a licensing complaint and an opportunity for mediation. There is no decision maker who resolves the dispute as was contemplated in Section 27. A complainant may be able to be paid from a contractor's bond, but bonds are small compared to the damage claims that often come up from new construction purchases. Because buyers may not understand the limitations of CCB complaints, Section 27 was deleted, and all reference to dispute resolution is now handled in the dispute resolution section without reference to the CCB licensing action. What questions do we have, Lina?
The first question is, if buyer submits their offer on an OR form, can seller respond with a counter offer on another form?
No, it's going to need to stick with one form library. So if the seller does not want to use the OREF sale agreement, there will need to be a counter offer, I would imagine, but it's going to have to be a sale agreement on the other form platform. You can't really counter the terms on an OREF sale agreement with a document that doesn't reference the terms and conditions of an OREF sale agreement. So ideally, buyer and seller are going to mutually agree prior to drafting an offer what form library is going to be used, but they are not interchangeable. You cannot counter. An offer would need to be rewritten on a different form library if that's the desire of the parties.
This question might have been answered in what you just said. So a counter to use the other form requires the initiating form as counter, correct?
Oh, can you read that again?
Yes.
I
So
got lost on that one.
so a counter to use the other form requires the initiating form as a counter, correct?
Correct. So yes, you would either counter or reject the offer and then submit the new offer on the other form library if that's what was desired.
Okay, next question. Buyer will not know that there are two different forms and will want to know the difference. Very confused. Oh, it's not a question. Very confusing to them.
So, as I know there are probably a lot of questions about how we're going to handle two different form providers in the marketplace. And as much as I would love to be that guiding light, reassuring everyone that it's all going to come together great, we're entering into uncharted territory. For many of us who have been in the industry for quite some time, there's only been one form provider. Now that there will be two in the marketplace, I think until we actually have circumstances where we're dealing with the experience of those two form libraries, it's hard to anticipate best practices in advance. So just know that OREF, we actually had a meeting earlier this week specifically talking around best practices. We are working to find best guidance for our subscribers and how to navigate the two forms library. Until the two forms library actually occurs and we start experiencing it, we may not be able to anticipate every complexity that's going to come up. Just know that it will remain high alert on our radar to make sure that we are making any adjustments or changes necessary in our library, in our training resources to support our subscribers as we navigate that new environment of two libraries.
What recourse does a buyer have if builder intentionally delays closing in order to sell at a higher price?
Oh, I'm not an attorney. I'm not going to be able to address that one. I would encourage you to consult with your managing principal broker or an attorney. I'm really prepared today only to talk about the form revisions that we're dealing with today.
Am I understanding we will need to carry multiple form libraries now?
So OREF Form Library is a subscription. Most of you, I'm sure, have had this subscription before. Nothing changes for OREF. OR, the Oregon Realtors, is launching a second forms library in February. As I understand it, I'm not involved in that forms library, so I don't want to speak for them. But from what I understand from the class I took, it is a member benefit offered to all Oregon Realtors.
So we need to print out each of the two forms for the buyer to review and decide which one before writing an offer.
I don't have an answer for you on the best practice for how to handle that with your buyers and sellers. I would encourage you to talk to your managing principal broker to see if they have guidance. And I'm sure that OR will be providing, as they roll out their training, which I believe starts next week, they'll be providing more detailed information as well.
Not sure this is an ORF question. It says, I'm wondering, as a listing agent, can I request a certain platform to be used when writing offers in the listing? Is the is this a manager question?
It may be a managing broker question. I'm not sure. I'm not an attorney. I want to clarify that. I'm a broker like the rest of you, who happens to be on the forms committee. I would caution that it is perhaps the seller who should be making the decision on the forms library to be used. If that decision needs to be made, I would encourage you to discuss that with your managing principal broker to determine best practices for your business and for your company.
Next question is, how can you ensure a seller won't show bias towards a specific form in a multiple offer situation?
I don't know that you can. It is certainly not a fair housing violation for the seller to make a decision based on the form. I'd like to believe that the seller is going to be looking at the terms that are going to help them achieve their goals in selling the property, and that the form that it's written on isn't going to matter as much as what the seller is going to net or receive from the sale of the property.
That's all the questions for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. The next form that's had a change is Form 12, the manufactured home sale agreement. Section 17 was inadvertently added to the manufactured home sale agreement. Section 17 is the Homeowners Association Townhome Planned Community section. Since manufactured homes without land in parks don't include a homeowners association, a townhome, or a planned community, this section was completely eliminated. Now, Section 9 of the manufactured home sale agreement still remains completely intact, which addresses the buyer's review and approval of the park's rules and regulations. The next form we have a change to, several of our addenda throughout your forms library, we've actually removed the selection boxes at the top of some addenda requiring the parties to indicate whether the sale agreement, counteroffer, or other document is being amended. Any agreed upon addendum is an addendum to the entire sale agreement, so these fields were unnecessary. Now, good news, for those of you that have used zip forms for a while, you know that there are multi-page versions of the generic addendum form 002 in the zip forms library. So if you have a very long addendum to draft, you could choose the 2 or the 3-page version so that you had multiple pages to type your long addenda into. That didn't exist in SkySlope or DocuSign. So the good news is, with our 2023 revisions, the 2- and 3-page addenda will be available on all of our platform provider partners. Do we have questions?
Yes. There are some HOAs that the MFH parks have. What happens there?
I'm gonna have to, I apologize, but I am not versed on manufactured homes. But manufactured home and lease on leased property is not going to include a homeowners association. Now, the owner of the park may be subject to an association, but the individual purchasing a manufactured home on leased land is not going to be involved with a homeowners association, is my understanding.
Is it true that ORF stands behind their form supporting agents when the form itself becomes a legal issue?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm not sure what you mean by stands behind.
I mean, I'll chime in, Colleen. This is Melissa Peterson at ORF. Our goal here at ORF is to provide as much support as we can, and we know that this transition and this change is going to cause a lot of questions, especially when it comes to the different providers. So we're here, our team is here and available. I will drop my contact information in the chat so you guys can feel free to reach out to me anytime. And I hope that answers your question, but that one of our biggest goals is to support agents. So I can definitely speak to that.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Those are all the questions. Thanks.
All right. The next form we're going to cover is Form 009, the backup offer addendum. This form has had substantial changes. We're actually going to go section by section through this form. The backup offer addendum, it now includes clearer definitions of backup position. And we've also built into the form seller's notice to backup buyer and backup buyer's notice to seller. So we've added scenarios where the seller is delivering written notice to the buyer. That written notice is now built into the form, and the buyer's ability to unilaterally terminate the transaction prior to moving into first position now includes a notice from the buyer as well. So let's go ahead and take a look in more detail, starting with lines 1 through 12. The form begins by clarifying that this is an addendum to the sale agreement and that any capitalized terms not defined in this addendum are defined in the sale agreement itself. We've also added a definition for first position buyer, meaning the buyer who's currently pending on the property, and second position, which would be our backup buyer. Lines 13 through 17, the buyer will be in second position and will have no right to purchase the property unless the first position transaction is terminated. And the seller has the right to negotiate freely with the first position buyer. So just because the seller has accepted this backup addendum does not mean that the seller cannot negotiate terms with the first position buyer to keep that transaction moving forward. Lines 18 through 27, the form provides a clearer explanation of the process that occurs if the first position offer terminates. The seller will notify the backup buyer within 2 calendar days using that new notice on page 2. Parties can then define when timelines in the sale agreement will begin. So the effective date or the calculation for the calculation of all of our timelines in the sale agreement can either begin on the first business day following the day the seller delivers the position notice. So the first business day after buyers moved into first position, or a date agreed upon by the parties. However, if the parties are unable to agree on the effective date within a default of 2 calendar days from the seller's delivery of the position notice, this second position transaction will automatically terminate. So this prevents a seller from potentially being held hostage from a non-responsive buyer who is dragging things out, and would allow the seller to get the property back on the market if that backup buyer has gone dark on them. Then we also have the opportunity to address the closing date. We can actually make the closing date a certain number of calendar days after the seller delivers the position notice, or on a specified date. So if that position notice is delivered to the buyer 2 days before our contractual close date, it's obviously not going to be realistic for the buyer to satisfy all of their contingencies and close in 2 days. So this allows the opportunity similar to the contingent right to purchase, where we can make the close date a moving target based on when the buyer is moved into first position. Lines 28 through 32, termination of the second position transaction defines the 2 situations when the backup offer can be terminated and defines how notice of termination should be delivered. So the buyer has the unilateral right to terminate at any time before being moved into first position. So as long as the seller has not sent the position notice to the buyer could elect to terminate by sending the buyer's notice that you'll see on page 2 of the form. The other way that the backup transaction would terminate is if the first position buyer closes, then the backup transaction is terminated and the seller will deliver that termination notice that's built in on page 2. So I'm not sure if any of you have experienced this. You're representing a buyer in backup position. And the only way that you know that your buyer's not going to get to purchase the property is because you see the status change in the MLS from pending to sold. And that's the only way you know that first position offer has closed. We actually built the notice in so that your buyer, your backup buyer, gets the courtesy of a notice from the seller letting them know that that first position has closed. Lines 33 through 36. On line 33, the backup buyer represents that they are not currently a party to a contract to purchase a different property. So when the buyer is making representations to the seller about their intent and ability to purchase the property, they're saying that they have not made those same representations to multiple sellers. Now, if you have a situation where you have a buyer who has the intent and the means to purchase multiple properties, you can always add in additional provisions, a clarifying statement to correct line 33. But if the buyer only has the intent and the means to purchase one property, the buyer can only make those representations to one seller at a time, unless they are disclosing to all sellers that they're making multiple offers on properties with the intent of only purchasing one property. Then on lines 34 through 36, we leave room for the parties to outline any additional any additional provisions. And then we get into our notices. So page 2 is where the notices are built in. The seller's notice to the backup buyer regarding backup offer is delivered by the seller for one of 2 reasons. Either the first position has terminated and the backup buyer is moved into first position, which would be the position notice, or termination notice. We're notifying the backup buyer that the first position transaction has closed. Then we have backup buyer's notice to seller regarding termination of backup offer. So if the buyer has decided before receiving the position notice that they don't want to proceed with this backup offer, the buyer has the right to terminate the transaction by delivering this buyer's notice to the seller regarding termination of backup offer. Lina, do we have questions?
No questions right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the next form that has changes is formerly known as Notice and Acceptance of Completion of Repairs and Corrective Action. The title of the form has been updated with the removal of the word "and acceptance." So the form is now just called Notice of Completion of Repairs Corrective Action. This form is used in conjunction with the OREF buyer and seller repair addenda in your library. On those forms, it states a deadline for the seller to complete the repairs and notify the buyer in writing that the repairs have been completed. This form was created as that notice of completion. feedback that we had received from subscribers and actually from real estate attorneys was that there is the potential for a buyer to have lost some rights of recourse after closing if there were issues with the repairs, if they signed a document saying they were accepting the repairs. So we've taken the acceptance portion out of the form. The form is now simply serving the purpose the repair addendum mentions, which is the seller's written notice to the buyer that the repairs are complete. So we also removed the text where the buyer confirms that the repairs or other corrective action agreed in this transaction has been completed and accepts the same. And the buyer is only acknowledging receipt of the seller's notice now with the form. This is what would then trigger the buyer's on the repair addendum. If you recall, the buyer would then have a default of 2 business days after receiving that written notice to perform their reinspection. So the form is just simplified to follow suit with the language that's already built into the repair addendum. We have some changes to the advisory to buyer regarding condo and townhome resale. There were some minor updates throughout the form for consistency and readability. We also missed the numbers on the left-hand side of the form, so we've got those added back in. And with those changes, the form was, we were able to reduce the form from 3 pages to 2. Form 53, agreement to occupy before closing. Section 5 was modified to address any heating fuel at the property when the buyer takes possession. The buyer will either pay the seller outside of escrow, or the fuel will be included at no stated value, like a personal property. A clarifying statement was added that this provision supersedes Section 26 of the sale agreement, which has the buyer pay the seller for the fuel outside of escrow after closing. Now, because the buyer's taking possession and will be using that fuel before closing, we wanted to add some clarity regarding the transfer of that fuel. And if the buyer is responsible for paying for it, that payment is happening on the day of buyer's occupancy. So it's now not related to the close date, but when the buyer actually takes possession and will begin using any fuel that's left in that tank. Section 13, we worked in partnership with representatives of the insurance industry to clarify the term additional insured. So the feedback we received was it's very challenging to get a policy, a buyer's renter's policy that includes insurance coverage for the seller as well, which was not really the intended purpose of this section of the agreement to occupy. The intention was for the seller to be notified if there were any changes to the buyer's policy coverage. So if the buyer stops paying or they modified the amount of coverage, the seller would be notified by the insurance company of that change. So in order to achieve that, we've simply changed the word insured to interest. So the buyer, when they get their renter's policy, is going to list the seller as an additional interest on the policy. And a copy of the policy is delivered to the seller at the address in Section 3. And Section 3 identifies where rent is being paid for that early occupancy as well. So we're going to have the insurance policy go to that same address where the rent is being paid to. Section 16, it was brought to our attention that there was no reference to the delivery of keys in the agreement to occupy prior to closing. So we've gone ahead and added Section 16 to address the seller delivery of keys and how that will be handled. And we've also removed the agent identification lines at the bottom of the form. So buyer and seller will still sign this document, but the buyer's agent, seller's agent, and their firm identification at the bottom has been removed. We have a question, Lionel?
Yes, so it says, as a listing agent, if we start our listing on ORA forms, shall it be required that the buyer to continue on ORA forms?
So I'm not sure. So OREF doesn't have any listing forms. The listing contracts are not covered in OREF forms. If you were using the OR forms for the listing, that's between the brokerage and the seller. What happens between the buyer and seller is a totally separate contract, and the parties can agree on whichever form platform they want to use. I notice I'm seeing a couple of hands being raised. Please, if you have questions, type those into the Q&A section. It makes it much easier for Lina and I to make sure all questions get answered.
The next question is there somewhere on PPG Toolkit where we can get copies of this training?
That would be an excellent question for the managing brokers at PPG. I'm assuming you mean Premier Property Group. This is a OREF class, so I can't speak to specific resources at your brokerage.
But it is available on the OREF website.
Thank you. I was just going to say, it is available. The slide deck is available on orefonline.com. And a copy of the recording will be appearing in Online Ed in the next day or two.
Okay, the next question is, why were the agent info lines removed? Just curious. Is it because it's really between buyer and seller?
That is correct, yes. It'll have more impact as we go through the agreement to occupy after closing, where it was also removed. For consistency, we removed it from both forms.
Okay, and that's all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll get into the agreement to occupy after closing. The agreement to occupy before closing, probably not used as commonly as the agreement to occupy after closing. So on this form, section 6 was modified similarly to address heating fuel. So same options. Is the buyer paying for the heating fuel remaining in the tank at the rate paid by the seller on the date the buyer is entitled to possession? Or is the fuel being included with the property at no stated value? And then just that clarifying line that this is going to supersede section 26, which automatically has the buyer pay the seller for it outside of closing. Section 9 added a clarifying statement directing the parties to use the additional provisions section to define when and why a buyer might enter the property during the seller's occupancy period. We had a subscriber request asking that we include some sort of provision allowing the buyer to enter the property during the seller's occupancy. And because there are so many variables that can come into play, it was really hard to develop some boilerplate language. Every circumstance is going to be different. So in section 9, where we talk about access and repair, we've added the statement, in addition, the parties agree that the buyer may enter for specific purposes described in additional provisions. So we've got a nice long additional provision section in the agreement to occupy. If the buyer needs to come in to measure for appliances or has contractors coming in to do work, that could be identified in the additional provision section as an extension of section 9. Section 13 has been revised to state the seller will deliver a copy of the renter's policy at least 5 business days before closing and will name the buyer as an additional interest on the policy. So just like we discussed with the last agreement to occupy. We've also added a line to identify where the certificate of insurance should be delivered. And section 16, we've updated delivery of keys. So the prior language was a little ambiguous in terms of who's responsible for the delivery of the keys. And in the contract between buyer and seller, there really are only 2 parties, the buyer and the seller. So we added clarifying language that the seller will deliver to the buyer and then how the keys will be handled. So This is not intended to negate any great customer service that you may choose as a broker to provide the clients that you represent. This is not intended to remove the ability for a buyer's agent to hand the keys over to the buyer on the date of possession on the front porch with the celebration champagne and the pictures on the front porch. Not at all intended to negate that. This is simply clarifying the language of the contract, which puts the responsibility of the keys on the seller. How the seller gets those keys to the buyer, you still coordinate all of that as the broker's involved in the transaction. And then the signature lines, we've removed the agent identification lines. The challenge with the agreement to occupy is that our agency relationship with our clients ends when the transaction closes. An agreement to occupy can extend for up to 90 days post-closing. So we've removed the agent identification lines because we can't amend the contract or enforce any of the terms or provisions adhering to the timelines. It becomes the responsibility of the parties to do so. So in order to avoid confusion as to whether or not we're still involved after the close of the sale, we've simply removed the agent identification lines at the end of the form. You have a question, Lina?
Yes, it says, why isn't there an NA option for fuel? It looks like you have to choose one or the other.
I'm going to go back to it. Just the sentence starts with if any heating fuel. So if there isn't heating fuel, if it's natural gas, if it's electric, you wouldn't complete anything on that section. The sentence starts with if heating fuel, propane, or other fuel is on the property, and then we address how it's being handled.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right, the next one that's had a change, Form 057 termination agreement. So item 1 of the termination agreement has the buyer and seller terminating the sale agreement and releasing each other from all obligations. And then the form previously said accept, and you had a blank line on line 7 that allowed you to identify anything the parties weren't releasing each other from. It was pointed out that some of the provisions in the sale agreement are intended to survive beyond termination. And so we wanted to add the clarifying language that signing this termination agreement does not negate any of those terms that were intended to survive beyond termination. So for example, the buyer has a professional inspection contingency. They have their inspection and they elect to unconditionally disapprove and terminate the transaction. The inspection contingency says that if requested, the buyer will deliver a copy of the inspection report to the seller. Just because the parties have signed the termination agreement releasing each other doesn't mean the buyer does not have to follow through on that term of delivering the inspection report to the seller. So if the seller requests it, even if they've signed the termination agreement, that provision survives and the buyer still needs to deliver the inspection report to the seller. The next form we have a change to, Form 058, Professional Inspection Addendum. Provision 1 of this form was modified to mirror the first option of the sale agreement for an inspection contingency regarding the delivery of reports to the seller upon request. So we've added the buyer will not provide all or any portion of the inspection reports to the seller unless requested by seller. But if seller requests all or a portion of the reports during this transaction or within 30 days following termination, buyer will promptly comply. And that is the only change on that form. The next form we have a change. Forming your library previously was titled FHA Federal VA Amendatory Clause. The title has changed. It is now the VA FHA Amendatory Clause and Real Estate Certification. We've also added check boxes so the buyer can identify which loan program they are leveraging, either the VA or the FHA. Now, it's important to note that both of these loan programs actually require that there be a provision in the sale agreement that says, if the property does not appraise at or above the purchase price and the buyer terminates the transaction, the buyer cannot lose their earnest money. That language needs to be added into the contract in order for these loan programs to go through, which is why you may remember receiving the certification, the amendatory clause and certification from the lender as we're progressing through the transactions, because it needed to be incorporated into the contract. So we added this form to the forms library to hopefully prevent the need for the lender to send us a document later. Now, I will tell you, if the lender has their form and they need it for their file, I say do whatever it takes to facilitate that transaction on behalf of buyer and seller. But hopefully the changes we've made to the form this year will cover any lender provisions that were not previously included, which is including the real estate certification. So we've also added a clarifying statement on the FHA clause, alerting the buyer and seller that the form may need to be modified if there's a change in the purchase price. So it says mortgagee must ensure the actual dollar amount of the sales price stated in the contract has been inserted in the amendatory clause. Increases, and it should be increases or decreases, any changes in the sale price require a revised amendatory clause. Then we've added the real estate certification. This is the big scary language, but we all need to sign this document with it when a VA and FHA loan are involved. So the certification was added. The borrower, seller, and the real estate agent or broker involved in the sales transaction certified to the best of their knowledge and belief that 1, the terms and conditions of the sale contract are true, and 2, any other agreement entered into by the parties in connection with the real estate transaction is a part of or attached to the sale agreement. Warning, the buyer and seller and real estate agents fully understand that it is a federal crime punishable by fine or imprisonment or both to knowingly make false statement concerning any of the above facts as applicable under the provisions of Title 18, United States Code sections 1012 and 1014. So with that language added, this should satisfy all of the language that is needed to be incorporated when an FHA or a VA loan is being obtained by a buyer. Oops, sorry. The next form we have, this form 096 was in your library as the COVID-19 deferral agreement. We were discussing as a forms committee whether or not it was time to retire the form as we've learned to work through COVID-19. It hasn't gone away. We're going to continue to deal with the virus in our world for quite some time, it seems. However, our real estate transactions, we have a better footing on how to navigate the transactions when a COVID-19 delay occurs. Well, what we realized was the provisions in this form actually could serve far more widespreading purposes if we made it an extraordinary event addendum. Now, an extraordinary event is something unforeseeable that is going to dramatically impact one of the parties' abilities to meet the timelines in the contract. Some examples of an extraordinary event might be 2 sellers on title and one of the sellers passes away right before closing. There may need to be a slight delay of the close date in order for the seller to resolve whatever they need to do in order to close the transaction. Or up in the Portland market, we had quite the windstorm the other day, tree limbs coming down through roofs. Maybe right before closing, a seller has a tree limb come through the roof of the house and they need to make substantial repairs before they can close the transaction and deliver the property to the buyer. These are extraordinary events. This form could be initiated by the party that has had the extraordinary event and propose modifications to the timelines in the contract. So the form has the party who's initiating this Clearly describe what the extraordinary event is. A lender being a day or two late on loan documents, really probably not an extraordinary event. That could probably be handled with a regular addendum. But if there is a significant event that is going to impact the timelines in the contract, the initiating party describes what their event is, and then they make the requested changes. And there's a whole list of all the different timelines that exist in your, potentially in your real estate transaction. Are we extending the inspection contingency, the title insurance objections, a contingent right to purchase provision? The initiating party is going to propose changes to the contract. The form then goes to the other party who can provide their response. Their response might be to accept the proposed changes. It might be to partially accept, but make some modifications, so a counter, or they're going to reject altogether and say, we're sticking with the original terms of the contract. So if there is any amendment to what has been proposed, it comes back to the initiating party to decide whether or not they can meet those modified terms. So this is a form, we don't anticipate it getting a huge amount of use, but for those extraordinary events, when they do come up, we wanted to make sure you knew this is a tool in your library. If you have a buyer or a seller that has an extraordinary event that may need to delay timelines. Other general changes that you'll see throughout phases 1 and phase 2 of our form rollout. Just to clarify on phase 1 and phase 2, all of the form providers that we work with, SIP Forms, DocuSign, SkySlope, they are making changes in all states across the country all at the same time. So we needed to prioritize the workload to make sure the most important changes were made right up front in your forms library. So phase 1 changes, you're going to see the changes to the sale agreement, the new forms in your library, the backup offer addendum. Those are significant changes. Phase 2 is going to be cleanup of language. Maybe we've reduced some legalese in the form, or an example might be the condo advisory for buyers, where it's just a formatting change. You'll see phase 2 changes reflected in your library by the end of the month. Some of the other changes that we've made, we've removed the title from the upper right-hand corner and replaced it with either the residential or the commercial to identify which library the form came from. So right underneath the sale agreement number on the upper right-hand corner, you may recall it used to have the title of the document there. It'll now say either residential or commercial so that you know which library the form originated. We ensured the form title is on every page of multiple page documents. We've updated buyer, seller, and property fields for consistency across all forms. We've ensured initial boxes are on any page of a multi-page document that signatures aren't. We've removed any instance of his or her and replaced with their. We've reduced the legalese verbiage for easier understanding for agents and their clients. We've updated signature lines and initials to be in the same format, buyer, seller, and agent. And we've added release date next to the copyright date in the footer to help agents ensure they're using the most current version of the form. So if the form has not had any changes in the year, the copyright date will not change. The release date will be the date that changes, even if there have been no revisions to the form. So you'll be looking to see if people are using the 2023 version of the forms. Take a look at the release date. The copyright date is the last date that we submit, OREF submitted that document for copyright, meaning it had substantial revisions and we needed to re-copyright the form. Questions, Lina?
Yes. Is there any legal issue if seller or brokerage chooses to require in their listing agreement, seller requires all offers to be on OREF forms?
That's actually advice that I have heard from a couple of different real estate attorneys, that if the seller does have a preference, the seller can make that preference known. So from what I've heard from real estate attorneys, that shouldn't be an issue. But again, I'm not an attorney, and I would encourage you to check with your managing principal broker.
Thank you.
All right, we are at the end of the presentation. If you have questions, as you probably have seen, a lot of the information that I shared with you today was a direct result of subscribers asking questions or sending in some suggestions. We want to make sure that the tools and resources you use every day in your business are meeting your needs and protecting your clients. So please, if you have suggestions or questions, submit those to customer service at orefonline.com. You'll see the phone numbers are also listed there on the screen for OREF. We take those submissions every month and review them to determine what may need to be amended in future versions of the form. So please keep sending those suggestions and questions in. For those of you that do not have any further questions for me, the class is over. Feel free to hop off. If you do have additional questions, as I said, I will stay on as long as it takes to answer your questions that are specific around the OREF forms revisions. Just type those into the Q&A section and Lina and I will tackle those now.
I'll go ahead and answer this first one. The first one is, will the recording be free on Online Ed if we need to refer back to it? And the answer is yes, it will be free on Online Ed. It also is going to be posted on our website, so you could go to our website anytime and reference the video. We will issue credit hours to anybody that meets the 1.5 hour minimum requirement for this session. And then moving forward, if you take the Online Ed course, there would be a credit hour there, but not if you've already received the credit hour through here. So if somebody who was not here took it, they could then get a credit hour through Online Ed.
Awesome, thank you. Or if they just really enjoy listening to me talk for an hour and a half.
They can just keep playing it over and over and over
Over
again.
and over.
Everyone's just saying thank you.
Okay.
We do have a question. If VA and FHA loans don't allow for loss of earnest money because of appraisal failing, what happens with earnest money has been released non-refundable?
So that is the challenge, is that if a buyer is getting a VA or an FHA loan, the sale agreement shouldn't have a term that contradicts what that loan program requires. So because those loan programs say the buyer can't lose their earnest money, that there couldn't be a release non-refundable without conflicting with the loan program. So the form, that's why we added the form to the library, is especially in the craziness of the market we've had the past couple of years, with buyers waiving contingencies and making earnest money non-refundable. If it's a VA or an FHA loan, it's important that the brokers understand that those loan programs don't allow the buyer to make it non-refundable for any reason. They could be for every reason except the appraisal failing, but not because of a low appraisal.
Then the next question is, oh, were you done? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm done. I was reading Ernest, his old fashioned. There's nothing about Ernest Cooper that is old fashioned. But no, we do not have a red line version. Okay. The slide deck, everything that we're covering here with the strike throughs is available on orefonline.com.
That's all the questions we have right now.
All right.
Oh, just kidding. Okay, so if release earnest money because of time frame, it is okay?
If earnest, I think you're asking if the earnest money was released for something other than the appraisal issue. I'm not sure I understand the follow-up question, Linda.
Mm,
Linda, if it's easier, I can unmute you and you can pose your question.
she asked again.
If earnest money released non-refundable for time reasons, does that supersede the loan papers? So if the buyer is terminating because of a low appraisal, time has no factor. The earnest money needs to be refundable to the buyer if the reason for termination is because of the low appraisal. I don't know that there's anything that is going to supersede that, since it is a lender requirement for the loan program. Aubrey, do you have a question?
No, no question.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
So Linda says, but what if the failure is inspection related? Okay, so if the buyer is not leveraging a contingency, I mean, the buyer can make their earnest money non-refundable for any reason other than failure of the appraisal. So if the buyer says, I'm going to make my earnest money non-refundable if I'm not satisfied with the inspections, that's fine. That does not impact the loan program at all. The only scenario the loan program requires that the buyer cannot lose their earnest money is if the appraisal comes in low. But if the buyer's terminating based on inspection and they made the earnest money non-refundable, the earnest money is probably going to be non-refundable depending on the quality of the language used to make those funds non-refundable. You're welcome.
Any more questions?
All right, doesn't look like it. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you,
Happy New
everyone.
Year.
Thanks,
Thank
Colleen.
you, Colleen. Happy New Year, everybody.